When people speak about infidelity, they often describe it as a violation of trust, and that is certainly true. But when the betrayal has lasted for years, when deception has existed quietly alongside the relationship for a long period of time, the emotional impact becomes something much deeper than broken trust. It becomes a collapse of reality. In a long-term partnership, we live inside a shared story. We build routines together. We create memories together. We make plans based on the belief that both partners are participating honestly in the same relationship. That shared understanding forms the psychological ground beneath the marriage. But when someone discovers that their partner has been unfaithful for years, the ground shifts suddenly and dramatically. What people experience in that moment is not just anger or heartbreak. It is often a profound disorientation. The mind struggles to reconcile two conflicting realities: the relationship they believed they were living in, and the hidden relationship that existed at the same time. This is why the discovery of long-term infidelity often feels like an emotional earthquake. Suddenly, memories begin to look different. A trip that once felt romantic may now carry a shadow of doubt. A period when your partner seemed distant might suddenly appear filled with meaning you didn't see before. Conversations, excuses, late nights at work, unexplained absences, events that once seemed ordinary may now feel like pieces of a puzzle you didn't know existed. And so the mind begins searching. People start replaying years of their lives in an attempt to understand what was real and what was not. They ask themselves painful questions. How did I miss this? Were there signs I ignored? Was any of it genuine? These questions are incredibly common, but they can also be deeply misleading, because when betrayal occurs, the mind often turns its attention inward. It begins to doubt its own judgment. But trusting your partner was not a mistake. Trust is not evidence of naivety. Trust is the basic condition that allows intimacy to exist. Without trust, relationships cannot function. When two people commit to each other, they do so with the understanding that honesty is part of the agreement. When that agreement is broken, the responsibility lies with the person who chose deception, not with the person who believed in the relationship. Yet the emotional shock of betrayal can make it difficult to remember that. Many people describe feeling as though the person they thought they knew has suddenly become unfamiliar. It is a strange and painful experience to look at someone you have shared years of life with and feel uncertain about who they truly are. You begin wondering which version of your partner is real. The one who laughed with you at dinner, supported you through difficult times, shared daily life, or the one who maintained a hidden reality behind the scenes. The answer, of course, is often complicated. Human beings are capable of holding contradictions. Someone can care deeply about their partner while simultaneously betraying the relationship. This complexity does not excuse the betrayal, but it does remind us that human behavior is rarely simple. Another challenge during this stage is the intense emotional fluctuation that often follows discovery. One day you may feel overwhelming anger. The next day you may feel sadness or grief for the relationship you thought you had. Sometimes people experience moments of numbness where the mind seems to shut down temporarily because the emotional weight feels too heavy to process all at once. All of these reactions are natural responses to trauma within a relationship. And that word, trauma, is important. Long-term betrayal can create a psychological injury similar to other forms of emotional trauma. The nervous system reacts with heightened alertness. Trust feels dangerous. The mind becomes hyper-aware of details, searching for further signs of deception. This is why healing cannot begin immediately after discovery. Before couples can discuss rebuilding trust or repairing the relationship, the injured partner must first have space to process the emotional shock. Too often, people feel pressure to move quickly. Friends may urge immediate decisions about divorce or reconciliation. The partner who betrayed the relationship may feel desperate to repair the damage as quickly as possible. But healing does not move at the speed of urgency. The first stage of recovery is not about solving the relationship. It is about stabilizing the emotional experience of betrayal. It is about acknowledging the depth of the injury and allowing the mind and heart time to understand what has happened. Only after this emotional ground begins to settle can deeper conversations begin. Conversations about the relationship, about accountability, and about whether rebuilding is even possible. But those conversations belong to the next stage of the journey. At the beginning, the most important step is simply recognizing the magnitude of what long-term betrayal does to the human heart. Because when trust collapses after years of deception, the question is not immediately how to fix the relationship. The first question is how to restore your sense of reality and your sense of self within it. Once the emotional shock of betrayal begins to settle, even slightly, another stage of the healing process slowly begins. And this stage can feel uncomfortable for many couples because it asks them to look beyond the affair itself and examine the deeper dynamics of the relationship in which it occurred. When people discover infidelity, especially long-term infidelity, it is natural to focus entirely on the betrayal. The affair becomes the central event that explains the pain, the anger, and the collapse of trust. And in many ways, that focus is justified. Cheating is a choice. It involves secrecy, deception, and the breaking of a promise that was fundamental to the relationship. But if a couple hopes to move toward healing, the conversation cannot stop at the affair alone. The reason is simple. Affairs do not happen in a vacuum. They occur within the emotional environment of a relationship that already exists. That environment may include connection and love, but it may also include distance, silence, resentment, or unmet needs that developed slowly over time. Understanding this environment does not excuse the betrayal. Responsibility for cheating always belongs to the person who chose it. But if couples avoid exploring the deeper relational patterns that existed before the affair, they often miss the opportunity to understand what allowed the relationship to become vulnerable in the first place. Long-term relationships naturally evolve over time. At the beginning, there is usually curiosity, excitement, and a strong desire to know one another deeply. Partners ask questions, they share dreams, they pay attention to the small details of each other's emotional world. But as years pass, life begins to fill the space around the relationship. Careers demand attention, children require energy, responsibilities grow. The relationship that once felt central to daily life sometimes becomes something that operates quietly in the background. Conversations shift from emotional exploration to practical coordination. Who will pick up the kids? What bills need to be paid? What plans need to be organized? None of this is unusual. In fact, it is the reality of many long-term partnerships. But over time, the emotional intimacy that once felt natural can slowly fade if it is not actively maintained. In some relationships, difficult conversations are avoided because they feel uncomfortable. A partner may feel lonely but not know how to express it without sounding critical. Another partner may feel unappreciated but choose silence rather than risking conflict. These unspoken experiences can quietly accumulate over the years. Sometimes one partner begins to feel invisible. Sometimes another begins to feel disconnected from parts of themselves that once felt alive. Desire, curiosity, spontaneity. And while these feelings do not justify betrayal, they can create an emotional climate where the relationship becomes less vibrant than it once was. When an affair enters this landscape, it often brings something that feels intoxicating: attention, novelty, validation, or emotional intensity. For the person involved in the affair, it may feel like rediscovering a version of themselves that had been dormant. Again, none of this makes the betrayal acceptable. The ethical responsibility remains clear, but understanding the emotional dynamics behind the affair can help couples see the situation with greater clarity rather than viewing it only through the lens of shock and anger. And clarity is important if healing is the goal. Because if the relationship returns to the same patterns that existed before the affair, the deeper disconnection may remain unresolved. The affair may end, but the emotional distance that allowed the relationship to drift apart could continue. This is why couples who attempt to heal often begin asking more complicated questions. What were we not talking about before this happened? Where did we stop being curious about each other? When did the relationship become more about functioning than about connecting? These questions are not about blaming the person who was betrayed. They are about understanding the relational story that existed long before the affair became visible. For many couples, this stage is difficult because it requires both partners to examine themselves honestly. The partner who cheated must confront the reasons they chose secrecy instead of addressing dissatisfaction openly. and the partner who was betrayed must decide whether they are willing to participate in a process that explores the relationship's vulnerabilities rather than focusing only on the betrayal. When couples manage to engage in this level of reflection, something important can begin to happen. The conversation shifts from simply asking, "Why did the affair happen?" to a broader and more meaningful question, "What kind of relationship do we want to create now?" That shift opens the possibility of transformation. Some couples discover that the crisis forces them to talk about things they avoided for years. They begin expressing needs, fears, and desires that were once hidden behind routine and silence. The relationship becomes more conscious, more deliberate, and sometimes more honest than it ever was before. Of course, not every couple chooses this path. Some relationships reveal fractures that are too deep to repair. But for those who attempt healing, understanding the emotional context of the affair becomes an essential step. Because the purpose of examining the past is not to assign blame more precisely. The purpose is to learn enough about the relationship to ensure that whatever comes next, whether rebuilding together or moving forward separately, is guided by truth rather than illusion. Once couples begin to understand the deeper dynamics that surrounded the betrayal, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does trust begin to return? Because after long-term infidelity, trust is not simply damaged, it is destabilized. It is no longer something that can be assumed. It becomes something that must be rebuilt deliberately, patiently, and often very slowly. Trust, in its simplest form, is the quiet belief that the person beside you is telling the truth about the life you are living together. It is the invisible agreement that allows two people to feel emotionally safe with one another. When that agreement is broken repeatedly over time, the injury reaches deeper than many people initially realize. The betrayed partner is not only dealing with the knowledge of the affair, they're also dealing with the realization that their perception of reality was manipulated for a long period of time. And that creates a very particular form of emotional uncertainty. Even after the truth comes out, questions continue to arise. If my partner hid this for so long, what else might I not know? If they were capable of lying before, how do I know the honesty I hear now is real? These questions are not signs of paranoia. They are the natural response of a mind that is trying to protect itself from being deceived again, which is why rebuilding trust cannot begin with a demand for immediate forgiveness. It begins with something much more grounded: accountability. Accountability is not simply an apology. Apologies can be sincere, but they are still words. Real accountability means fully acknowledging the impact of the betrayal without minimizing it, without becoming defensive, and without trying to rush the healing process. The partner who was unfaithful must be willing to sit with the discomfort of the pain they caused. They must recognize that their actions have fundamentally changed the emotional landscape of the relationship. And that change takes time to repair. One of the most important elements in rebuilding trust is transparency. When secrecy has been the mechanism of betrayal, openness becomes the mechanism of healing. The partner who cheated often needs to become more transparent than they have ever been before about their daily activities, their communication, and their emotional life. This transparency is not about punishment. It is about restoring a sense of predictability in the relationship. When the betrayed partner begins to see consistent openness, the nervous system slowly learns that the environment may once again be safe. But transparency alone is not enough. Trust is rebuilt through patterns of behavior repeated over time. It is rebuilt when promises are followed by action, when difficult conversations are not avoided, when honesty remains present, even in moments where lying might feel easier. These small moments accumulate. Each one may seem insignificant on its own, but together they begin forming a new pattern of reliability. For the betrayed partner, this stage is also complicated. Part of healing involves deciding whether they are willing to remain open to the possibility of trust returning. After betrayal, many people feel an understandable urge to protect themselves by becoming emotionally guarded. Keeping distance can feel safer than risking another disappointment. But rebuilding a relationship requires a certain willingness to engage with vulnerability again, not immediately and not blindly, but gradually as evidence of change begins to appear. This does not mean ignoring doubts. Doubt is part of the process. The difference is that over time, those doubts are slowly replaced by lived experiences of honesty. Still, it is important to acknowledge a difficult truth. Not every relationship can rebuild trust after long-term betrayal. Sometimes the damage is simply too deep. The emotional safety that once existed may never fully return, no matter how sincere the efforts are. In other cases, the betrayed partner may realize that the relationship no longer aligns with the life they want to live. And that realization is not a failure. Healing does not always mean staying together. Sometimes healing means understanding clearly why the relationship cannot continue in its previous form. But when couples do attempt to rebuild, the process becomes an opportunity for something unusual in relationships: radical honesty. Conversations that once felt too risky suddenly become necessary. Feelings that were once hidden begin to surface. The relationship becomes less about maintaining appearances and more about confronting the truth of who each person really is. In this way, the painful rupture of infidelity can sometimes lead to a deeper form of connection than the relationship had before. Not because the betrayal was beneficial, but because it forced both partners to engage with the relationship in a far more conscious way. And consciousness changes everything, because trust does not return when the past is forgotten. Trust returns when truth becomes the most consistent presence in the relationship. And when that happens, when honesty replaces secrecy day after day, something powerful begins to grow again, the possibility of believing in each other once more. When couples begin the difficult work of rebuilding trust, something else slowly becomes clear. The relationship that existed before the betrayal cannot simply be restored as it was. That version of the relationship, the one built on certain assumptions, certain routines, and certain unspoken agreements, has already ended. This realization can be frightening at first. Many couples begin the healing process hoping that, with enough effort, things will return to the way they once were. But the truth is that healing after long-term betrayal does not involve returning to the past. It involves creating something new. In many ways, infidelity marks the end of one relationship and the beginning of another. Even when two people remain together, the relationship that emerges afterward is often fundamentally different from the one they had before. The old structure has been exposed. The illusions that may have existed about the relationship have been disrupted. And now both partners have the opportunity or the challenge of consciously designing what comes next. This is why some couples who survive infidelity describe the experience as creating a second marriage with the same person. The first marriage may have been built on expectations that were never fully examined. Perhaps there were assumptions about loyalty, communication, or emotional closeness that were never explicitly discussed. Many couples move through years together believing they understand each other, while certain parts of their inner lives remain hidden or unspoken. After betrayal, those hidden spaces can no longer remain invisible. Healing requires a level of honesty that many couples had never practiced before. Conversations that once felt too uncomfortable suddenly become essential. Partners begin asking questions about needs, desires, frustrations, and fears that may have been quietly present for years. What do we actually need from each other emotionally? Where did we begin losing connection without noticing? What boundaries must exist if trust is going to survive again? These questions shift the relationship from something that simply exists into something that must be intentionally built. And intentional relationships are different. They require awareness. They require communication that goes beyond daily logistics. They require both partners to remain curious about each other's inner worlds rather than assuming they already know everything there is to know. For the partner who betrayed the relationship, this new phase often requires sustained humility. Repairing the damage created by long-term infidelity is not something that happens quickly. It involves consistent accountability and a willingness to remain emotionally available even when conversations are uncomfortable. Trust returns gradually through repeated experiences of honesty and reliability. But it also requires the betrayed partner to decide at some point whether they are willing to participate in building this new relationship. That decision is deeply personal. Some people find that, over time, the process of healing actually creates a stronger and more honest partnership than the one they had before. The crisis forces both individuals to confront truths they had been avoiding, and the relationship becomes more conscious as a result. But not every couple chooses this path. Sometimes the process of reflection reveals that the relationship cannot or should not, continue. The betrayal may expose deeper patterns of disrespect, emotional disconnection, or incompatibility that cannot be repaired. In those cases, healing may involve letting the relationship end, and even that outcome does not mean the process has failed. Understanding the truth of a relationship, even when it leads to separation, can still be a profound step toward personal clarity and growth. What matters most is that the next chapter, whether together or apart, is built on awareness rather than illusion. Because one of the quiet dangers in long-term relationships is that they sometimes drift into patterns that go unquestioned for years. Couples assume that love alone will sustain the partnership, even when communication becomes shallow or emotional needs remain unspoken. Infidelity, painful as it is, disrupts that complacency. It forces both partners to confront questions that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. Questions about honesty, about intimacy, about the effort required to maintain a living, evolving relationship. And while the betrayal itself may have been destructive, the process of confronting these questions can lead to something powerful, the chance to create a relationship that is more deliberate, more honest, and more emotionally awake. But this only happens if both partners are willing to approach the future with openness and courage. Because healing after long-term betrayal is not simply about repairing what was broken. It is about deciding what kind of relationship and what kind of life you are truly willing to build from this moment forward. And sometimes the most important step in that process is recognizing that love does not survive on habit alone. It survives on truth, intention, and the courage to begin again.